Hello, everyone. It is the host of the Hungry Country Ball Show, Grayson, and we are back for round two of the debate we did last week. Last week's debate was a interesting debate, and so we are going to carry on with this debate. I first want to start with our panelists and introduce a. For the opening, I want to ask it as a question. How did you come to the conclusions you have in your policies? And we'll start with you, Justin Lee.
All right, thank you. So I have come to my conclusion of non-interventionist because I believe that the US should focus more resources on building a better future for itself because all the strongest empires fell because of internal problems. If we are strong internally, we can deal with any external threats that may come our way in the future.
All right, and now we'll go on to the libertarian nickname's blanking, so I'll just call you the libertarian. Esmond speaks. How did you come to the conclusions you got to?
Okay, so as I said in the first stream, I used to be pretty pro-interventionist, and what changed my mind was understanding that the United States has a lot of problems, whether it is on issues of civil liberties or on issues like public debt, on issues such as like infrastructure, on jobs, on the tax code, etc. A lot of pressing issues, and there's a whole host. It's not just those. It goes well beyond that, of these issues that exist, and the idea that if we're having to intervene in another country's problems, we're just going to eventually just be ignoring our own problems. And if we're going to intervene in another country's affairs, it better be over a very good reason, whether there's proof that if we don't, we'll be attacked, or ultimately, like, let's say a wave of fascism happens and we do not intervene, it eventually will come for us. If that can be proven, and I say there should be a high bar of proof for that, then I would say that's fine. But overall, I came to the conclusion that it would be better not to intervene in another country's affairs, with exceptions, was because of the idea that a lot of the problems at hand are simply just not our problem. If I'm to be pragmatic, I guess I would say if we've already made promises and you just want to fulfill the promises you made to your allies, that's one thing. I'd say just don't make any more promises. And if you know you can't keep those promises, or they are not willing to keep those promises, then you're going to have to put your foot down and break those promises. Overall, I would just say that it was mainly just seeing that how not every ally in NATO was paying the 2% of GDP that they said that they would pay. It wasn't just some random number. They said, yeah, we'll pay the 2%, and then not every one of them does. And I understand it's kind of dangerous to say out loud, if you don't pay the 2%, we'll let you be a sitting duck. But I'd say making that veiled threat behind closed doors might convince them and not inspire aggression from one of our big adversaries like Russia or China. But overall, it's just the United States has its own problems it should deal with first. And then once those problems are dealt with, or at least chipped away through the word is escaping me, but it's like slow progress, then maybe we can reconsider helping other countries out with their problems. And that's really what I got to say there.
All right, and now we'll go to the neocon ghoul, Kevin Castley.
Okay, thank you for having me on, Grayson. Can you hear me all right currently?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. You finally got that mic.
I did get a new mic. That's correct. Yes. So, we don't have the crappy audio anymore. That's good. So, as far as how I came to my views in terms of, we're specifically talking about interventionism, right? Not just general economics, that kind of policy. Right? Yeah. So when it relates to interventionism specifically, I think one of the I've always been hawkish, but I've not always been publicly hawkish, and so in high school I wasn't publicly hawkish, and up until fourth year university I wasn't publicly hawkish. But for me, it really kind of began watching 9/11 unfold. I was 7 years old at the time, and I didn't really know anything about politics or whatnot. But I was pissed. I wanted to be an architect before that, and I wanted to see New York and everything. And I always thought those buildings looked really cool. And I didn't even necessarily appreciate like the loss of life aspect at the time. I was pissed about what happened, and I saw George Bush, his retaliation against the people who did it, and like I was basically in love with Bush. Like he was my idol in that sense, and I still consider him one of the greatest leaders in modern history. And so, as far as the more substantive sort of policy, material comes into it, as I got older, as I got more into politics and everything, I considered the viewpoints, a ton of sides, did a ton of devil's advocacy. I hung out in high school, basically every group from, anarchist communists to literal white nationalist fascists, see what they're about, what they believe in. And for me, it was always kind of obvious. I was like, oh, well, I believe, that we shouldn't be gulagged in the night. We shouldn't have mass purges, this kind of thing. And I don't think that that's just something that I like. I'm aware that that's something that all people would prosper in. And so I always was like, I always found relativism to be this cancerous sort of confused, incoherent sort of framework. And so I was always a moral universalist as well. But once I got into university specifically, and it was very clear to me that, there was an information campaign against us to discredit interventionism. And, I basically decided, somebody needs to be out here publicly, vocally supporting the propagation of our interests and our values, because our enemies, they do a fine job of that. Somebody needs to counter them, because our lamestream media definitely won't do it. And the thing is, when I look at the situation in North Korea, I look at the situation in Iraq before 2003. Or, if we're talking just purely from security angle of it, you look at, the terrorists, Afghanistan and whatnot. You look at the situation in North Korea. I regard as the most pressing and dangerous threat right now facing us. It's very clear, if you have any sort of historical knowledge of how these things unfold, that buying a couple years of quote unquote peace in exchange to give the enemy more time to, on the margin, build up disproportionately relative to you, their military assets, is only going to delay an inevitable war, which is going to get even more people killed. And so I would say, to kind of conclude here, if you understand the lessons of World War II, it's to act sooner rather than later. That Neville Chamberlain was in the wrong to say, oh yes, I got us peace, I got us another few years before we have to fight Germany. Yeah, but if you fought Germany right away, a few million people might have died. You wait, tens of millions of people die. Oh, great. I guess I hope you enjoyed that peace, right? It's not really peace. If you believe in world peace, you believe in true peace, meaningful peace, not enmity, not Cold War, not whatever we call peace right now. You would want to see, the Western world become the entire world. And that's the only solution. That's the only workable solution. And if we don't follow through in ensuring that vision, our enemies will make fine work of ensuring their vision, and we will live in a world which is characterized by fascism or communism forever after that.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Okay. I'm good. I'm sorry, this isn't directed towards anyone, but I'm probably gonna have to limit the intros to 2 minutes. So Net7, nickname for Net7.
Thank you for having me. I
No
appreciate
nickname,
it.
so I guess you.
What? Excuse me. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. I was just saying, I can't think of a nickname for you, so.
Okay. Well, let me just say where I come from. So, it's been varied, really. I started off in a Republican household. I looked at libertarianism, though, in high school. I was a Christian anarchist from high school to 2012, when I started listening to Ron Paul, or now who I call Wrong Paul. And I became a Ron Paul style libertarian. I was very much a part of his idea of non-interventionism and stuff like that. That was until 2016, and when 2016 I studied abroad over in the Czech Republic, and also got to stop over in Poland. It was when I was studying Holocaust studies, and this was really the turning point for me when I started touring concentration camps / death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is located in Poland, and the Terezin concentration camp, which is located in the Czech Republic. I also toured areas where there were SS holding areas, torture chambers in Poland, in Krakow, and I also got to see different areas where in the Czech Republic that were Holocaust related. This is the turning. That was the turning point for me. This is when I started to have doubts about non-interventionist policy, and I started to say to myself, well, if this is the result of non-interventionist policy, then I don't know if non-interventionist policy is a good policy, because I heard the arguments Ron Paul kept saying, and others non-interventionists kept saying, that it's not our concern, it's not our business, and that was the same thing said. And I saw the effects of that, and I realized, I'm just wrong. So that's at that point I became a neo-libertarian. For a time, I tried to, on Twitter for a time, try to essentially bear the torch for an interventionist style of libertarianism, which was the idea that we need to spread libertarian freedoms ideal globally and need to be prepared to use force to do so against tyrants and despots. But overwhelmingly, I began to see the hypocrisy among libertarians that they believe in this idea of freedom for me, but not freedom for thee. They want their freedom, they want their cake, but they want to be able to eat it, meaning that they want to have freedom here, but they don't care if there's freedom for anyone else abroad. So that's when I abandoned neolibertarianism, became a neoconservatism. So I'll close there.
Okay, and last and not least, we have Liam O'Mara, who is you look a little sleepy though. Just saying.
It's just been a hard year, and it just keeps getting worse. So it is what it is. For this question, I guess there are two different things that I'd have to bring up, and I'll keep my comments shorter here, or as short as I can. The first is that my personal principles lean much more toward the a kind of live and let live, cooperative sort of mentality. Understanding again, things don't always work and people aren't all the same, but I align much more with the libertarian socialist side of things. I would rather not have concentrations of power, period, whether it's political power or economic power. I would like to, I prefer more empowering a kind of direct democracy. And in that sense, again, this doesn't really apply much to politics because it's a completely impractical political philosophy, but it's where I come from as a human being. And because I prefer thinking in terms of limiting power over individuals, the idea of using overwhelming force really has to reach a high bar to justify itself for me. And that's where, again, I'm not sort of an absolutist on anything. Yeah, if I see, if there's a country that's like building, straight up death camps, then yeah, you got to do something about that. I have no problem with those kind of interventions to stop genocides. I think that we should intervene to stop things like that. But for me, I guess the other half of it, and the thing that makes me cautious about interventions and more nuanced in a lot of them, is that I pay close attention to causal relationships and how things play out over time. And if you can see the way that even the most well-meaning sort of ideal can lead to extraordinarily negative consequences, it should give us pause, at least, to evaluate whether or not a particular situation warrants the intervention. And you could probably pick, I mean, you could pick almost anything out there. We could talk about a particular well-meaning intervention in the last 200 years, and we could point to significant problematic consequences of it that might have played out differently otherwise. And this is not, again, to say that some of them shouldn't have happened. Things happen as they do. I mean, it all happens for a reason in some sense. But the point is, I think that we should be very careful in our judgment about when to do something, because there's always blowback, unintended consequences, blah, 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 everything else. So that's the short version there.
All right. So I guess now we can start getting into the fun part of the debate, and I will first show you how the new concept I've come up with for this debate. Anyway, do you all see the spinning wheel?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our topics are on the spinning wheel, and so obviously you can kind of see where I'm going with this. The topics can just be selected at random through this. I just found this to be the best idea. So without further ado, I'll give it the first spin. And it looks like our first country was Ireland and the UK. So I don't know how I want to do this order. I guess I'll start with Kevin and then work in a way that goes like neocon, progressive, neocon, progressive. So I'll start with Kevin. We'll start this on the border dispute specifically and other issues with Northern Ireland, the Troubles, and some of the historical context, if you want. Basically, on this subject, you can talk about what you want that's related to Ireland and the UK. So you have the floor.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Grayson. So, with regards to the situation in Ulster, Northern Ireland, I think it's pretty clear that the United Kingdom is on the good side. Now, it's not an area of the world that I necessarily focus that much time of my attention to. I mostly focus on North Korea, Russia, that sort of thing. However, the United Kingdom is a major ally, and it's clear that the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, what they constitute is not only a terrorist group, which in and of itself would be very bad, but they are also a group that is has a notorious history of working with Gaddafi, who was an absolute tyrant, an absolute butcher of Libya. And in addition to that, of course, he was the one who basically orchestrated the Lockerbie bombing. It's the sort of thing that if you really just believed in promoting Western interests and standing with your allies and everything, it's very clear that the United Kingdom is in the right. That the IRA and the movements that oppose British sovereignty over the area are unironically socialists. They just are. You look into the Sinn Féin, you look into the IRA, connections with Gaddafi, and they're socialists, if not outright communist, and they need to be neutralized. So thank you.
All right, and I guess we can start with since he gave his opinion, this would become the reaction section. So I'll go to Justin for any response, so if he wants to give an opinion.
Well, I do want to respond to Kevin's criticism of the IRA. I think I guess it is rightfully based. They have committed some terrorist act in the past. And you say that they have connections with Gaddafi, and Gaddafi is a tyrant, but under Gaddafi's rule in Libya, their standard of living have risen, and actually since our
hold on. We'll get to Libya in a minute. This is on Ireland.
Yeah. If we're gonna
Um,
do Gaddafi apologetics, I'm gonna have to respond at some point. So
Yeah, well, we're not right now, but this is on
Well-
Ireland. So
Well, on the Ireland, I kind of do agree with Kevin, but I was trying to focus onto the UK and more so their Brexit situation, which I think it's completely a unfounded fear because if you've seen the UK's past voting records within the EU, they've voted 92% of the time they're in favor of the EU's resolution and decisions. And the top one reason I believe that the Brexit was able to happen was because the Sun, owned by News Corp, spread misinformation and led the people to believe Brexit was the right decision. And I will end my commentary here.
all right, and so we'll go to Net 7.
Thank you very much. Well, my position is very strongly for Ulster and for the United Kingdom in the Irish Brexit situation. The fact of the matter is that in the Brexit situation, the new IRA, Sinn Féin, and other organizations like like Sorada, like it's Irish. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but are trying to take advantage of the Brexit situation in order to try to create a 32 county Ireland against the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland or Ulster. The fact of the matter is that these organizations have tried to essentially force the British government to leave Northern Ireland when the majority of the population still want to remain within the United Kingdom. And I think it's so the fact of the matter is that in these Brexit situations, the United Kingdom obviously has to work with the Republic of Ireland on making a deal on the border. But we need to be careful about this, though, because the new IRA has already said on record that they would view a border as a legitimate target for attack. And organizations like CIRU, who have ties with the new IRA, will use this to their advantage. I mean, we've already seen tragedies, that, like, for example, that one journalist who was killed by the new IRA when they were trying to essentially shoot at the British police. Lyra McGee, I think, was her name. The fact of the matter is that we have to be careful. But as for the negotiations between how that border works, that's up to the Republic of Ireland and that's up to the United Kingdom to decide. But I don't like the idea of anyone using this negotiations to take advantage of that and try to force a 32 county Ireland when the people of Ulster don't want to join the Republic of Ireland. So I'll stop there.
Okay, and then I guess we go to Esmond Speaks. So his opinion on.
Okay. I'd say that any of the decisions over border disputes, I would say it's really up to those people to make up their decisions and whatever deals they got to make. I tend not to focus on Europe a whole lot. I tend to focus on Latin America. I tend to focus a lot more on South America. But basically, I just say whatever choice they're going to make with Britain the IRA, I'd say I hope it's a choice they can live with. And even if I may not agree with the decision, I would say that I hope that they have thought this through, kind of like Brexit. I don't know if they would have if they had gotten the chance to have a second referendum, as some had wanted. I don't know if they would have voted to reverse or overturn the first one, but I'd say that with things like these, they gotta ask themselves, how exactly are we going to know if the grass is really greener on the other side? Because it was a close vote, and it shows it was divisive. I'd say my biggest gripe was how long it took for them to actually leave the European Union. If you're going to do it, I think you might want to consider your plans or your process of leaving well in advance before you put it up to a question of shall we stay or shall we go. With Britain and the IRA, I side with Britain on that issue. The IRA, it just seems like they're a little too incoherent to support. Maybe they could change that, but overall, I would say that I would say that I don't know who you're talking about in the private chat, but yeah, actually, that's all I really have to say. Because if we're going to talk about Gaddafi later on, I have a lot of things I want to say about him, and Kevin might agree with me.
We'll get there, but
But yeah, essentially, that's where I'm wrapping up. Go ahead.
And we'll go to the final panelist, Omara, and I have a feeling she might have a little Irish in him based on the name Omara.
Oh my gosh.
Well, yeah, there is, and in fact, there are some unionist roots certainly, in the as well as Republican roots and whatnot. I mean, my family's kind of mixed. I have most of the Irish part of my family is from down Tipperary and Cork, but there's a small Scots-Irish component to it as well. The Ulster Scots and all that. Anyway, I guess I'm going to give two sort of contradictory points on this. The first is, I think that if we're going to talk about terror groups at all, then it really makes sense, and this is something we can get into later too, that to understand the interplay between terror and resistance. Because obviously, the American War of Independence, we were the terrorists. It's really a matter of where you stand on particular issues, what makes something terror or not. And there are people, like the IRA, who were fighting for something that they legitimately believed in and for their home and to get out a foreign occupier. So I think that there is a good reason to be sympathetic to that kind of feeling. On the other hand, I am deeply opposed to nationalism on principle. So even though I kind of like the idea of a united Ireland to kind of undo some of the historic injustice of invading and, settling people in Ireland in the first place, the simple fact is it is a settler colony. And there are descendants of people who migrated over from the UK, particularly from Scotland, and settled there. And they're Irish too. And they deserve a say in what happens, which means that for me, I don't give a damn about either side. I want a democratic solution that the people on the ground can all accept. And the only way that the government should have any play here at all is in trying to come up with the best compromise to make more people happy. That's kind of why I liked both countries joining the EU together, because it erased the internal border. Even though they were separate countries, you could travel freely. If they can come up with some way to just get along and live with each other, because the population is pretty evenly split in its demographics, so tensions are going to stay high regardless. And one side or the other loses regardless of whether it becomes part of the republic or stays in the union. So I would just want it to be a democratic choice and not forced by either, whether that's forced by a terror movement, a resistance movement, with a long grueling war, which, sometimes plays out in the world and you have to leave, or a kind of forced movement by the state. I think both of them are essentially unjust. I think that the people should decide what they want in terms of final status, and the governments should cooperate to make that final status as palatable as possible to the majority of people.
Okay. And I'm probably gonna have to change the format a little just because it may go on for a while, but I'll let any panelist who wants to make a response to another one, you can speak now or you forever hold your peace on this subject.
Yeah, I'll make a point real quick on this. The fact of the matter is that when we look at, Northern Ireland, when we look at the history of the region and we look at what the IRA is, and I talked about this in the last debate where I said that not everyone who calls himself a freedom fighter is a good person or a good group. Sometimes revolutionary movements that call themselves good are not good. And I would call the IRA one of those, because if the IRA then who, and the IRA, is largely gone. Most of the members are now either living modern lives or are a part of Sinn Féin, which was the political arm for the IRA during the Troubles, or have become more militant, have gone to the new IRA, or organizations like CIRU, which continue to advocate for the quote unquote struggle. The fact of the matter is, with the IRA, if they were fighting for their freedom, well, they could have done it through the democratic process in Great Britain. It's not Britain. Great Britain was not a dictatorship. It had an electoral process. Yes, there were claims of discrimination from Catholics, claim they're being discriminated against Protestants, and I would say that some of their claims may have been legitimate. But what the IRA did is that they then started targeting anybody. They targeted police, they targeted army personnel, but civilians. And a lot of their bombs that exploded were killed civilian casualties. Most of their attacks were against civilian infrastructure areas. So if they were really a good group fighting for their quote unquote freedom, they weren't. Why would they have essentially put their own people hostage? So that's why I don't support Sinn Féin. I don't support the new IRA, and I don't support CIRU. And the fact of the matter is that the issue of Northern Ireland, or what I call Ulster, the people have made their decision clear. They don't want to join the Republic of Ireland, and if they don't want to, that's up to them, and that should not be forced upon them.
Okay, and so I guess with that, unless anyone has any other
Well,
notion,
I would just say as a quick point along there that yes, I'm critical of any terror movement that targets civilians. And again, that's why terror and resistance kind of overlap, regardless of what you think of a particular goal. Terrorism is still a strategy, and terror frequently does target civilians and does harm ordinary people. But governments do that too, and we shouldn't justify state terror, and say, oh, that's okay because they have an army or they're the police. If the army opens fire and kills civilians, if the police open fire and kill civilians, they're committing a terrorist act. And that's generally what prompts terror resistance movements to do it. The IRA didn't start targeting civilians; they started targeting, police and military figures. Same with in the Algerian War. Initially, the FLN targeted only police and military figures, but as soon as the Pieds Noirs started bombing people, they started responding against civilians, and you get a tit for tat. There's no justification either way. I would not support the response of killing more civilians from that side because it takes away your own moral high ground. But we shouldn't forget that state terror is also a thing.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to
Well, I just have to chime in really quickly.
Okay.
I think it's worth noting that state terror is a thing because we got people out there that'll say Iran and Syria, they're legitimate states, and ISIS are terrorists and everything. I think it's good that we can get some common ground here and say, yeah, states can do terrorism, that you can regard state actors, just because they wear suits, just because they're the Muslim Brotherhood, doesn't mean they're not terrorists. And I'll oftentimes have people say that to me, well, ISIS are terrorists, at least Assad's, order or whatever. It's like, no, Assad's a terrorist. He just has a state to do his terrorism for him. So
Okay, and with that, we can go on to part 2, and not part 2, but the next topic. Hopefully, maybe we might have. Well, we have the Asian countries now. So, for those, basically to clarify, the Asian nations are the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. 10 countries: Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. So, obviously, some of those nations can be a topic for a whole video, but in order to keep this short, I'm going to say this. I'll put Justin to make his position on the Asian nations, and then we can have response and discussion time after that to keep this shorter. So Justin, you have the floor now.
All right, thank you, Grayson. So for the Asian nations, it includes 10 members, which are Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And it is important to remember that the Asian nations are mostly it's an economic union. It's similar to the European Union, but more loosely connected. And they have a lot of influence. China has a lot of influence over the Asian countries, and and even countries within the Asian economic union itself have um, a love-hate relationship with each other. So we should be really careful to not just say Asian as an entire block, because they are not as unified as we think, and many of its members have disputes and even conflict within themselves and with each other, and that's my point.
Okay. Anyone have other things to add on Asian or opinions?
Sure. I mean, do we put up a hand, or how do we do this?
I'm not sure. If you just want to talk, you can. And it doesn't have to be Asia. It can be about any specific nation in Asian too. So
So do you want to do last time? One progressive, one neoconservative, and then again?
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I'll go on that, because I'd like to talk about one of those nations in particular, right now, Myanmar. Right now in Myanmar, we have essentially a government, a military dictatorship, which essentially, so for the viewers who don't understand how elections work in Myanmar, here's how it is. So when Democratic parties win, and they usually win pretty decisively, what happens is that the military party, yes, the military actually has a registered political party in Myanmar who does their bidding. They essentially say, oh, there was fraud. Oh, this is a bad election. You know what we're going to do? We're going to cancel the election. We're going to have a transitional period for a year or so, and then we're going to have another election. And the reason for this is not because there was actual legitimate fraud or there was actual electoral concerns. It's really just because the military in Myanmar, whenever it loses, just decides essentially to use the gun and say, well, we're taking charge, screw the elections. And the fact of the matter is people in Myanmar are suffering as a result of it. We've seen numerous articles recently where, Myanmar military or police or even some of their supporters are literally ganging up on pro-democracy people and beating them up, assaulting them, and in some places even just shooting them. And we've had a tragic number of deaths there. And this is a region right now, not only where is there political turmoil, but also we're seeing ethnic turmoil. And the Rohingyas, which are a largely Muslim group in the northwest of the country and the west of the country, have been persecuted by the radical Buddhists in the country and by the military who support them. Essentially, what is going on in Myanmar is you have the Rohingyas who are literally being treated as less than second-class citizens. They're not. It's so in the Western mindset, in Western-style democracies, if you're born in that country, you're a citizen of that country, right? In Myanmar, it's totally different. If you're a Rohingya, you're not considered a citizen. You're considered essentially stateless, almost in fact, because to them they base their citizenship not on where you're born, but on your ethnic group and on your religion. And so what we're seeing in Myanmar, and I would implore you guys read the book I need to find real quick that I read. That talks about the Rohingya persecution. I think we really need to consider intervening in the country to prevent the military dictatorship from not only one, committing a genocide against the Rohingyas, but two, literally propping up its false its police state, essentially.
Okay, so do we have any reactions from any of the progressive sides? I guess this is just going to become Myanmar specific because the other nations aren't as milkable. I'll say.
I don't have any like disagreements with how he characterized the situation in Myanmar. It is a tragedy to see what's going on over there. As he had said earlier, on the 1st of February this year, just for everyone who doesn't know, the head of state in Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, I probably mispronounced it, maybe not. She was deposed of. She was leading the civilian government, and well, she's not anymore. And I mean, you see the carnage, you see all these things. I don't know if Liam or Justin would disagree with what Net7 said in terms of how their elections quote work, and with how it's naturally a bad sign for any democracy or any country that is even remotely having any remnants of democracy when they have a political party that is basically just a front for a military. It's essentially the elections are not even worth participating in when you know full well that they're just going to overturn the results with the gun. So I don't have any qualms with what Net7 said. I think that maybe the one thing we can all agree on right now is we're all very glad we're not on the ground in Myanmar during this time.
Well,
There's a few.
response.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if we're going progressive, neocon progressive. Yeah. So, couple points. First one, I also want to talk about Myanmar. So I did a stream over on my channel, Superpower Broadcasting, right after the coup happened, and I had some panelists there. I think Grayson, you were there actually, if I recall
I think
correctly.
me and Net7 were actually there, so
Yeah, and Net7 as well. And the general consensus of the panel that we had was that, look, if we think they're just going to round up people and that's that and everything, and nothing too bad is going to come of this, we're dead wrong. And we all said there's going to be a big purge eventually. We looked at some imagery of protesters who would go out there and they would hold up signs, some in English, saying, we don't recognize the legitimacy of the junta. And guess what? Well, sooner or later, they just killed 100 people yesterday. So the Hawks are vindicated again. This happens all the time. And it's easy, like I say with the case of somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, who would say, oh, not a problem or whatever, or I don't like it, but at least I'm not there and we shouldn't do anything about it. Like, it's easy to be for peace when you're living at Cushy on a beach in Hawaii. It's another thing when you're actually on the ground there and you happen to be born there. And I think, if we actually did acknowledge that humans have dignity, what we would do is we would do a very, immediate, before it even got out of hand. Like, if I was in charge, it'd be like the first week, basically, either covert or just outright conventional incursion into the country to liberate the country from the regime. This is a regime that is favorable to Putin and somewhat favorable to China. This is not good for Western interests. And if you believe in democracy, well, this is a clear example of the democracy that's on the ground there being overturned. Guess what? It was a young, frail, weak democracy. And we stood by and said, you know what? We're not going to defend that. And guess what? If you don't protect things that are fragile, it's easy to break them. And that's really the problem there. Now, the second ASEAN country that I'll talk about is Vietnam, actually, because it doesn't really get discussed too much. And when people do discuss Vietnam, it's in the context of, well, how can they help us against China and everything? Yeah, I got news. The Vietnamese people are very favorable to the United States, very favorable to capitalism. In fact, they have some of the highest approval of capitalism in the world, which makes sense because they're forced to live under communism. So, of course, they can appreciate capitalism more than a lot of people that are upset they have to work for minimum wage or whatever for a couple of years in capitalist countries and don't know how good they have it. That country needs to be liberated. The Vietnam War is not done. And the Vietnam War was basically won for America, except America threw in the towel because of KGB-sponsored domestic fifth column within the country. So I would say that's the one country where the whole meme of we'd be graded as liberators would be the most true, because they're an incredibly pro-American and pro-capitalist population, but their government is incredibly evil and incredibly communist. So thank you.
all right. Do we have any responses to Any other responses? Well, I guess Liam, because you're the final progressive, you get the response.
All right. So yeah, I guess there's a couple points to hit here. One sort of broader point, if we were going to talk about the ASEAN countries, it wouldn't have occurred to me to dwell so much on the Burma situation, but I'm actually not unhappy that it came up. And I think it's another area of overlap, of at least agreement, even though we might differ on how things should be done, that genocide should be stopped. And, this kind of like violent movements you can see in any culture, any religion. Yes, Buddhists can be terrorists and commit genocide. It's possible anywhere because humans are all dicks, basically. We're all capable of the same, bad things and good things. It's part of our common inheritance. So I think that we should be able to respond to things like that. My preference in responses and what I would have liked to see really evolve, and this kind of puts me at odds with a lot of, the more conservative or nationalistic strains, is I would have preferred a more international approach to anything like that. I don't think that countries should unilaterally be engaged there. I get that we have the ability to do it, but why are we alone spending all the money to have that ability? Why don't we have an actual empowered, UN with a more political structure that then can authorize force? And the whole point really of the UN, just like the failed Kellogg-Briand Pact and things like that before, were to prevent, armed conflict between states and to provide an ability to intervene when states do attack other states or attack their own people. And this is sort of like a classic case where if we had a UN that actually had any balls, which we don't have and never have had, that actually could put forces on the ground under its own command, not like current structure where it's all like under the command of those countries. So they can say, hey, don't shoot at anybody. And then they just stand there and let the crap happen. A lot of the blue helmets don't do a whole lot of good because of the political structure of it. I would have preferred a stronger multilateral framework to deal with things like that. And then as an international community, we could all say, hey, genocide bad, and intervene. As far as ASEAN in general, I think one of the biggest issues, and one that comes up a lot in foreign policy discussions, which, I imagine is our topic here, right? The South China Sea is a major, major artery for world trade. A huge amount of it passes through that area. So control of the seas in those areas does kind of matter. And there's a lot of territorial disputes over the unmanned islands. Look at like the Parcel Islands, the Spratly Islands, things like that, where because the Chinese have the power at this point, they're just going and dumping in sand and, expanding these artificial islands and planting bases on them. And that's sort of problematic in the context of rising tensions with the US. The last thing we need is another long drawn out Cold War where we're fighting for supremacy versus them in the Western Pacific. It's just a titanic waste of time. If there was some way to kind of defuse those situations and recognize the sovereignty of different countries over these areas, I think that's a really significant area, a problem area that we need to resolve. There's a lot of unresolved problems in that region. I mean, hell, look at the situation with Taiwan, which is also in Southeast Asia. And that's a really long-term unresolved dispute. And then, of course, you have the weird situations in like Hong Kong and Macau, which also have an unusual status. They went from colonies that didn't have democracy to part of communist China, and now they want democracy. And now, of course, communist China is also not going to give it to them. And you get, again, back to this whole question of shouldn't people be able to choose their own form of government? Kind of like, shouldn't they democratically be able to voice an opinion here? So yeah, I would like to see stronger multilateral involvement in resolving the territorial disputes in the South China Sea so that they do not become a flashpoint for conflict and we don't end up fighting a war over such a major, trade artery.
Okay, so I'm reading the private chat. I think as
Brunei.
long as no one has anything else to say, I'll let Net7 say one quick thing on Brunei, and then we can move on to this subject.
Interesting country too. Yeah.
Net7, you had something.
Yeah, I'd like to mention Brunei real quick about that's another country in the region too that I don't think gets much talk because it's absolutely very tiny. But I'd also like to mention something too as sort of an olive branch to my fellow progressives. Look, because I know a lot of progressives talk that we should increase, the number of refugees and things like that from countries. And I'm all for bringing in refugees from Brunei, because again, Brunei is a country where there's a lot of persecution of Christians. It's not open violence like in some places, but there's certainly a lot of dictatorial paranoia. The persecution level there is high. Christians don't have equal rights because, again, Brunei is essentially a Sharia state. So I do believe that certainly, we should increase refugees, from Brunei who are Christian, who are trying to escape that sort of persecution. So if for those who say, we should increase the number of refugees from different countries, hey, I'm all for it. Let's talk about Brunei, about bringing some, Christian refugees from there to the United States or to Canada or whoever, so we can get them out of, the persecution they're facing and give them a better life.
I would agree with things like that, but one quick point I'd like to make is it honestly bothers me a lot when we focus on specifically Christian refugees from different areas, because I mean there's a real problem with that kind of there's a kind of cultural chauvinism that still kind of like overlaps there. People who are oppressed in general should have the right to apply for asylum and refugee status. I don't care what their religion is. And the Brunei government is actually quite oppressive just in general. It has a high level of human development because they actually invested oil wealth well, but it has a quite oppressive legal system. In that way, it's quite similar to Singapore. Also, similarly high standard of living, but quite an authoritarian approach to governance. And I have a problem with authoritarian states just in general.
Okay, and so with that, we can go on to the third topic. This thing works.
Time to spin the wheel.
Fun fact, though, Brunei is ranked 5th in the world by GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. Just random fun fact.
Okay, so see which topic the gods choose for us today.
Nigeria.
Yes, Nigeria and no country.
What?
Niger.
Yeah, I just say no country for funny meme reasons, but I just, yeah, close to that other word, but other than that, that's not important.
for heaven's sake.
This is not a new Darnell channel, but I digress.
You're very silly. Very silly.
Okay, but anyway, we will. So, avoiding funny names aside, Nigeria and Niger do actually play an important role in foreign policy. It is Nigeria and Niger are like the sort of the epicenter of the Boko Haram insurgency, which is a major terrorist organization. And also, sorry, Liam, for calling you probably another controversy, because I know the Owen stands are rating my channel right now. So other than that,
oh my god.
Yeah, but other than that, Net7, I'll let you start the conversation on Nigeria and Niger, because I'm obviously not mature enough to handle that.
So what are we passing to? What's the
Net7? If he's there.
Well, thank you for letting me go. So when we talk about Nigeria and Niger, one of the serious things about the region is the jihadists who essentially use, the area to fund their activities and to commit terrible acts. There's a recent article in The Guardian where a suspected jihadist attack in Niger, now the death toll has now hit to around 141 people that have been killed in jihadist attacks. And so what's going on in the region is essentially you have Al-Qaeda elements who are essentially trying to use the area to sort of gain their strength in Africa. And that's nothing new. Al-Qaeda has definitely tried to use different parts of Africa to support their activities, not just in Somalia, but they've tried to infiltrate themselves into Central Africa. And now we're even seeing them in parts of Eastern Africa, which is obviously very concerning and needs to be looked at. But when we talk about what's going on in Nigeria, once again, it's very nice to have little quotes like, remember the incident where Boko Haram captured a bunch of schoolgirls and took them hostage and prisoner. You know, it's very nice and soft to have these memes saying, you know, bring home our girls. You know, I mean, even the then president of the United States' wife, Michelle Obama, you know, had that pitch, you know, as, you know, pleading essentially for the group to release the girls and let them go. If this is the best that we have in terms of combating terrorism, then we're screwed. The fact of the matter is, a terrorist like these who capture young girls and then forcibly marry them off to their jihadist fighters, or essentially sexually traffic them. And thankfully, yes, thankfully we did get most of the girls back, as far as I'm aware. But the fact of the matter is that who knows what happened to them while they were in their custody? And if we're trying to negotiate with terrorists like these, I mean, seriously, we've gone really far down the hole. I mean, we should not be listening. We should not be negotiating with groups like these, because they don't negotiate in good faith. Two, negotiations with them only play in their defense, because they're essentially a time where they can reacquire their strength and try to gain international legitimacy. And it's just a frankly stupid and suicidal policy. I remember once in an Al Jazeera interview, there was a former IRA guy who was being interviewed by Mehdi Hassan, and he was actually asked in this episode of Head to Head, you know, should the United States negotiate with Al Qaeda? And he said yes. I mean, come on. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we need more boots on the ground in Nigeria and Niger, because we have a duty to the international community as the United States, as the biggest superpower in the world, to combat terrorism worldwide. And we should not ignore terrorism just because the people are black. Because what we see in Africa is people ignore it out of racism, in my opinion. They say, oh, well, it's just tribal conflicts. It's black people killing black people. I don't care what happens. So no, we have to deal with it, because these jihadists are killing innocent people, mainly Christians, and we have to stop it.
All right. So, any response from the progressives?
Yeah, I can throw a few points into there.
Okay.
One of them is, and this again, it's sort of like with the Ireland position. I have to present kind of contradictory positions on it, because there was a real problem with groups like this, with these kind of terror groups, but they do emerge out of the long-term, socio-political climate. And a lot of that does have to do with the longer history of colonialism in the region, the continuing sort of like economic imperialism. When France pulled out of places like Niger, they basically set things up as a dictatorship that would preserve all their business interests so they could continue to exploit the area without having to have troops on the ground. And this does end up getting problematic, because where you see this kind of terror and jihadist terror growing up is in areas with extremely low human development, and low educational standards, health standards, basically infrastructure, jobs, everything else. People don't want to strap bombs to themselves if they have a good chance at a good life. It's a lot harder to build up movements like that. It's one of the reasons that terror has declined so significantly in Europe since the 1970s. Living standards have gone up. If we had allowed for greater human development in the first place, we wouldn't have to constantly think about military intervention. So I guess my more nuanced position on this is that, yes, we do have to intervene against specific terror movements. We have to stop violent militants from harming innocents. But the solution is not indefinitely military, because that's playing whack-a-mole. Every time you're blowing shit up, you're continuing that decline in living standards that feeds more terror groups, and someone else can point to you, hey, look, they're the bad guy, they're the enemy, and then that builds up more sympathy for the jihadists. If you're going to spend the time going in there hunting these terror groups and stopping them from committing these atrocities, you have also to invest in building the area up and building good schools and clean water and healthcare and everything else, so that people have something to look forward to other than, I'm going to blow myself up for paradise. That'd be my quick comment there. And yeah, I think the longer term history of French control in Niger and then British control in Nigeria. And of course, that gets back to the whole cobbled together structure of the entirety of Western Africa. They frequently put together traditional enemies in the same country and then split populations apart across two countries for two different colonial powers to make them less governable. And then we blame these countries for having poor governments that can't get people to get along because we sort of forced that situation on them. I think that while you can't, at this point, it's too late to go back and fix all the borders and correct that kind of stuff, we do have some responsibility in helping to build up greater tolerance and democracy and support for the institutions so that they function adequately in all the different regions. Because if a particular minority group, if like, I don't know, your Fang tribe or your Wolof peoples or whatever, like the different populations of West Africa end up having majority power in a country, one of their traditional enemies tends to get screwed. And they're also citizens of those states. But there's no long history of, I mean, think about how difficult it was to develop democratic institutions in Europe, to develop just the concept of a loyal opposition. There's still a lot of countries in Europe that struggle with the concept of a loyal opposition and immediately want to go after their political enemies when they gain power. So think about how much more difficult that situation is in the post-colonial world. I think that if we invested more effort in helping people to build responsible institutions that treated all peoples equally as citizens and provided adequate services, again, people would have less reason to join ethnic militias and religious militias and fight that way.
Okay, I know Kevin wanted to respond to that, so I'll let him.
Well, it's not so much of a response necessarily to what Mr. Omar was saying. It's more, I more wanted to touch upon and echo what Net7 was saying. One of our mutual friends, Net7 and mine, as well as yours, Grayson Suzuki over on Twitter, who I think he goes by Hawk Aurelius right now. Yeah. He has a blog called Suzuki Speaks, and he's got some rather long and detailed essays on there looking over, historical data and injustices and everything. And the thing the real moment that Hawk killed him was the example of Rwanda. And he has a piece that I recommend everybody check out called The Road to Hell. And it's talking about Rwanda. And he talks about this idea how in the West we have this notion that like, oh, peace is good and involving ourselves, that would be white savior complex and that'd be bad. And people could die if we got involved in everything. And a lot of the people that opposed intervention in Rwanda came from a well-meaning place. They weren't like America First neo-Nazis. They were like anti-war hippie kind of people, basically. And he explains very clearly how, for an intervention that, might have seen no casualties from American troops, instead you had 1 million people die because the West stood by and let it happen. And I think what's happening in Niger and Nigeria isn't to the same extent by any means of what did take place in Rwanda, but we need to understand something. And I've got 2 points here. The first point is, just as in the case of Rwanda, a large portion of the motivation to not intervene there, but to intervene in, say, the former Yugoslavia, for example, or to have a really strong military position in Europe, it is racial. There's definitely a racial component. It's similar to the Middle East, too. There's a reason a lot of people don't really care about what happens in Lebanon or what happens in Iran or what happens in, say, Yemen right now. Or Nigeria or Niger. It's because they're not white, and so they don't want to intervene. It's the same reason why you'll see a lot of these anti-war people say, "Oh, we want to get tough on China, and we don't like China, but Russia, let's not do anything about them." Sometimes there's a racial component, not always. And I've argued against there being that case universally. I think there are a lot of people that their issue with China is why they focus on that is because of jobs and stuff. But generally speaking, I mean, you heard it from some guy. I think it was even Tucker Carlson who said, and now I'm not 100% sure on the exact quote, but basically, why are we going to send white boys to die for these monkeys? Basically, there's this idea of, look, it's a paraphrase. I don't have the exact quote, and it was off the record, but that is a quote that was attributed to Tucker, and I mean it's consistent with his worldview when it comes to interventionism. Look, if it's an issue happening in Canada, for example, let's say that there was a big terrorist group that rose up there, Canadian government couldn't handle it, and asked America for assistance. feel like a lot of people in America would say, yeah, we need to take out these terrorist guys. Those are white Canadians. But if the Nigerian government asks America for help and America agrees to do so, what do we have? We have the progressive media lobby in America, you know, Secular Talk, Jimmy Dore and everybody talking about, this is the 8th war. America's bombing Africa. It's another war. It's wars. They're sending our kids to die over there. And why? Because they're black, because you're going to help a black country, basically, ward off terrorism. There's definitely a racial component to it. And the second point that I was going to get at there is, let's be clear about something. This isn't like some invasion against a sovereign government, which I support many of those, by the way. The Nigerian government, the sovereign government of Niger, asked America for help, and America agreed. So even in the framework of sovereignty, bro, and Westphalian peace and everything, totally legitimate action against terrorists. So thank you, and I'll be back in a minute.
Okay, so is there any response from Justin?
Yes. I feel like I'm going to respond to what has been said so far, and I'm going to emphasize what I said during our China debate a few episodes back on this channel. I believe it is essential for us to have a Marshall Plan 2.0 for the global south. Like Liam O'Mara has said, if we develop those nations and have basic infrastructures set up, and we can allow the people to live a better life, they won't be radicalized as easily like the jihadists. And the reason why Europe right now has the peace it enjoys is because we have the Marshall Plan, and we did something similar in Japan and South Korea, in which we allowed them to have we accumulate wealth and build the basic infrastructure necessary to lift their citizens out of poverty and create a burgeoning middle class. And I think if we replicate those successes in Nigeria and Niger, we will have peace. Because and I do agree that we should intervene in Niger and Nigeria, where terrorists are attacking innocent civilians. But we can't just go send out our military forces here and there and here, because at the end of the day, we don't have that much manpower to police around the world, and it is better for us to use economic development to make sure that the countries settle down, and then we can achieve truly peace, because it is achievable. It's in human nature to want a better life. And the reason why so many people join the jihadists in Niger and Nigeria is not because they actually believe in their cause. Like, they don't actually believe in the cause of these terrorist organizations. It's because these terrorist organizations provide them with things like shelter, food, and security, and that's why they're joining these terrorist organizations. So I believe if we can solve the source of these problems, the terrorist power in these regions will greatly diminish. And like Net7 have said in the closing statement of the last episode, death to all tyrants.
Okay, and I guess I should have Esmond give a comment, because we haven't gone to him in a while. So
yeah, just very quickly, I strongly disagree and disapprove of any foreign policy positions being held because of a racial component. Hang on just a second. My dog loves to come in the room because she's kind of up there in age. But basically, I think if you're going to support oppose an intervention, it should have nothing to do with race. Like, oh yeah, we'll intervene over there because they're white, or we're not going to because they're non-white. I've said before, and I'll say again, that I found the America First group to be pretty racist, even for their time. They're not even that subtle. But just quickly, yeah, I just find if you're going to support or oppose an intervention, it should be because of the merits of or the idea of the circumstances behind it, not because of the identities of the people that the pro-interventionist people are saying we could save or that we could potentially save. You know, if you're going to support or oppose it, it should have nothing to do with their identity, but because they're in peril. But other than that, as what Net7 said earlier in the chat, he said that Nigeria and Niger, if I've mispronounced it, sorry, should consider uniting into one country. I could support that. I'd say have them both have like a referendum each. And because I'm not a tyranny of the majority type person, I'd say make the referendums get 55% of the votes in favor of it for it to succeed. Other than that, I assume we're going to talk about the UN later on in the stream. If not, we can save that for another time.
Yeah. Okay, so if there's no other comment on that, we can go to the next subject.
Can I throw a couple quick things on there?
Okay.
I mean, one is just from the end there. I don't understand, like, Niger and Nigeria don't really have much of anything in common. It's completely different geography, history. There's no, it's not that they were separate. They literally, there's no reason to put them together. The name is similar because of a river. So yeah, I'm gonna say yeah, no, there. But I do agree that there is a massive chauvinistic component in a lot of interventionist discussions, and I think that's true on both right and left. And whether you're talking about the historic or current America First kind of like anti-interventionist sort of ideal, that's often deeply chauvinistic, but also you see it on the progressive left as well. And people may be less, unwilling to support an intervention in some place like Kosovo, right, or Bosnia because they're white people, but will ignore East Timor or Darfur because they're non-European peoples. And I think it's a lot more a matter of cultural chauvinism and just what we know about, because Americans just don't know a damn thing about Indonesia or Africa in general. So it's a little easier to kind of relate there. So I think a lot of that bias is entirely unconscious, but it is a significant problem. And I think that policymakers and pundits should really work hard to make their case against that chauvinism, to show that we should be focused on the merits and the justice and the human tragedies here, not where they're from or what their religion is or this or that.
Okay, so with that, I guess we can go to the next topic once I get... Okay, let's go for the Wheel of Misfortune. All right, we got an interesting one. It's Georgia, Ukraine, and specifically their relations to Russia. So I don't know who wants to go first on this one. I guess I'll go first on this one. Georgia and Russia. So the essential history. It's like 2000. Actually,
2008.
Yeah, 2008, I believe. It's like Russia invaded Georgia. They now have like two sort of countries that they took from Georgia and like Russian, and they also did the same to like Ukraine in 2014 with Crimea, and then they did that in the Donetsk War. And so basically, I'm against that because we've seen from history that, yeah, as Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, but we've seen through history though that uniting people based on a certain nationality they were happened before, and we gotta know what happened after that. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a German thing. So other than that, I want to make sure Russia cannot do anything against Georgia and Ukraine, and that could mean deterrence against the Russian invasions. And so that's my position on that. I guess I'll let a progressive go next. So
go ahead, Liam.
Yeah, I can pop them with a few points here. And again, it's kind of complicated. The issue of these breakaway states, whether you're talking about Transnistria and Moldova, or Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, or like pulling away the Crimea and then supporting the Donbass. I mean, all these different like little breakaway things. It's just hypocritical power relations bullshit. Because look what the Russians did in Chechnya. Look what they continue to do in places like Dagestan. If there are people that don't want to be, Russian per se, the Russians will crush them. But if it's in one of the neighboring former Soviet states that they no longer control, they're interested in intervening. And a lot of that has to do with a desire to maintain their relevance in the region, their power in the region, and not to see a kind of creeping, Western alliances. They don't want places like Georgia to join NATO. And now NATO ain't going to touch Georgia with a 10-foot pole because you inherit those breakaway states in a possible conflict with Russia. I mean, there's a real power relations dynamic to that. And to me, that's the real human tragedy of this, because the people who really get fucked are the people on the ground who just want to live day to day and just, be ordinary people. I think that people have the right to choose what they want to live in. If people want to be part of Georgia, great. If they don't, great. But I don't understand why we care so much about separatism, other than the fact that it affects international power relations and the great power politics there. I think that, again, me being a believer in real direct democracy, I would prefer people being able to choose to live in a large confederational type state, a federalist sort of like state there, or breaking apart, and that should be ultimately up to them. I don't know, just really flash back to the past. Remember, we were just talking about Nigeria. Does anybody remember the Biafra War with the Igbo people? I mean, it's kind of ancient history now because you're taking us back into like the 60s and 70s and whatnot. But, a chunk of southeastern Nigeria fought a war against that government to break away because, the Igbo people were not happy being a minority in Nigeria. Those kind of problems happen all over the place. And while I don't like nationalism as an idea, I still think people should have the right to choose their own government regardless. So it's a really kind of like tricky position with these states, because I'm not like somehow inherently opposed to people's breaking apart, but I don't think it should be done for hypocritical power relations. I don't think Russia should be interfering, or us, in order to put countries together or tear them apart. I think any force from the outside shouldn't be there.
From the neocon?
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, so on Ukraine, we'll start with Ukraine. So Russia has been interfering in Ukraine for a very long time. And there's a lesson here in Ukraine, which is that Ukraine, in the early days of the post-Soviet era, gave up their nuclear weapons. They had, at the time, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. They gave that up and transferred it over to Russia in exchange for a security guarantee so that they wouldn't need to have nukes for defense. And then guess what happened 20 years later? Well, Russia invaded their sovereignty directly. Initially said it wasn't them, it was just volunteers or whatever. And then after the status quo of Russian control over Crimea was established, Putin came out and said, oh yeah, it was totally us, bro. Haha, what are you going to do about it? Now, what would I have done about it? A little bit different than what Obama did about it. Obama was weak. Putin knew it. He sensed weakness. So weakness breeds conflict. Even if you don't want to do war, you want to give off strength so that your opponent won't mess with you. Obama gave off weakness and we got conflict. What happened was Russia invaded Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. And their justification for doing so was, the Ukraine was going to get close to the EU, and our puppet Yanukovych, we kind of like him, but he was flirting with the EU too, and that's bad. So we're going to go in there. And of course, the eastern portion of Ukraine has been so brainwashed and so kept away from any access to open information for decades. Even in post-Soviet era, they only have television that only tunes into Russian state TV and stuff. That, of course, they were going to vote for the party of regions. They didn't know any better. They hadn't been really exposed to democracy as we would know it. And Putin went in and seized upon some of the radicals in there and used them as this sort of spearhead. And they were able to take a good chunk of the eastern portion of the country. And that's still under their de facto control right now. And it's a problem because Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. It gets very hard to change the status quo once they've already taken ground. you can deter them from taking ground and say, hey, look, we'll nuke you if you take Eastern Ukraine. But once they've got Eastern Ukraine, it's a little bit harder to get them out. Obama just didn't care. He didn't do anything. Now, what would I have done when I suggest happened is when it was clear what was going on, say, look, we're not going to tolerate any sort of Russian incursion into the region. Because, again, remember that the context, the reasoning that they gave in part was, oh, there are Russians there. There are ethnic Russians there, which, of course, there are lots of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So we need to go in and protect them. By the way, there are ethnic Russians in Estonia, too. And guess what? There are ethnic Russians in Canada, and there are ethnic Russians in America. So by that logic, everywhere is Russia's sphere of influence, essentially, except like maybe Sao Tome and Principe. Maybe there's no Russians there. Who knows? But basically, all the big countries in the world, you could say, oh, we're just going in to protect Russians, bro. And of course, that's, as Grayson alluded to, that's what Hitler did with, oh, we're just going into Poland to save Germans, man. That was also his pretext to go into Georgia too. Now, Georgia, unlike Yanukovych, Georgia actually had like a pretty good democratic sort of aspirations and everything going on with like Saakashvili, for example, and then America really and the West at large should have stood in solidarity more so with Georgia. Now, what's impressive about Georgia, though, and you got to give them a lot of credit here, because Georgia is a very small country. And yes, they spend a disproportionate amount of their money on the military, but not necessarily that much, not like North Korea or anything. And yet they were able to more or less fight off a Russian invasion from, one of the biggest superpowers in the world, the number 2 superpower in the world. They were able to repel Russia by and large and only lose a little bit of their territory at the same time as they were fighting in Iraq. So Georgia deserves a hell of a lot of credit, and I think that they should be immediately inducted into NATO as honorary members. What I would do, I kick Hungary and Turkey out. I'd put Ukraine and Georgia in. It would have been better if Ukraine and Georgia were inducted into NATO before the incursions happened, because and I know people say, well, you can't really bring territorial dispute countries into NATO. I'd make an exception for those guys, and I'd say very clearly, Russia, you want to take more territory from them? Well, your territory is going to be irradiated if you do it. So, and they would not screw around that. And you would have it. That's the only way that you can ward them off, because otherwise they're going to play sneaky stuff. They're going to send in the little green men and everything. And I think only the massive retaliation doctrine would be enough to say to Putin, no, it's not going to happen. As for Russia, get to the last country. We don't have to do a full war with Russia to remove the Putin regime. They get 67% of their revenues for the government from the export of oil and gas. Here's what we do. U.S. drills oil as much as possible. Canada drills oil as much as possible and gas. And we export that to Europe at a loss and make it dirt cheap and lose money on it, because it's a Marshall Plan level investment in not having to do a nuclear war. And that will see the bankrupting of Russia. It'll see the complete turning away from dependency on Russia towards Western gas for energy, Western oil. And we will win the Cold War without even having to fight Russia, because within a year or 2 years, just like in 2014, except you keep up the heat, the system will collapse. Even the biggest supporters of Putin, once he's got no money for their pensions to keep the lights on and stuff, even like old grannies that supported him because he was like virtuous and he was keeping out the West and stuff, they're going to go in, storm the Kremlin, and say, you're done. We got to get somebody that'll actually pay our pensions and stuff. And that's the opportunity that you have then to move into the country and ensure that what emerges from it is in your interest and in the spitting image of the West. And so it basically drill, baby, drill, as Sarah Palin said. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that Justin wants to say something about this.
Yes, I actually have 2 or 3 main points I want to address. So, Kevin, first of all, said that he wanted to have Georgia be added into NATO, which I don't personally disagree with. It might be a good idea, but he said that if he was Obama, basically, he would threaten Russia with nukes, and he also said previously in this episode that a war with China is inevitable. But aside from that, like just focusing on Russia, Russia have a large nuclear arsenal, and if we do nuke Russia, I'm not saying we should, but if we do nuke Russia, they are going to nuke us back, and it will be the end of humanity, or it will be the end of this cycle of humanization, human civilization as we know it. So that's a thing that I want to prevent at all costs. And second of all, Russia's oil dependency was discussed in the last episode. I'll state it here again. The green energy is the best possible solution I could think of to move Russia away. In the last episode, you guys, the neocons, claim that Russia is investing in green energy alternatives, but their revenue isn't that big in green energy alternatives. If we just transition Europe and the rest of the world to green energy, Russia's oil exports advantage will be nullified. It will be nullified without having to dramatically produce more oil and cause further climate change, which will hurt us in the long run. And I just want to say that if we are really tough on Russia, they might retaliate against us with nuclear weapons. You know, as much as we're trying to contain Russia from swallowing up these territories, we have to remember this is not World War II, where we don't have nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons that are 100 times, 1,000 times more powerful than 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And we do not want to be wiped out and bombed back into the Stone Age. And I think the war hawkish position needs strong considerations when dealing with countries that have nuclear arsenals, such as Russia, China, Pakistan, India, and Europe. And I end my commentary here.
I'll let you respond. I mean, if you want to,
Yeah.
Kevin.
Yeah, I have a response. So the first is I didn't say just preemptively nuke Russia. The point about Putin, for example, is that he doesn't want to die in a nuclear war. If you make it clear to him that if he screws around, he would, he won't. He won't screw around. That's the whole point of deterrence. Second point is, yeah, Russia has a lot of nukes and everything. That's why I'm trying to seek a way to neutralize them without having to do a nuclear war with them. Green energy, by the way, for the record here, I'm not opposed. In fact, I would support Western countries moving towards, renewable energy sources and, more efficient vehicles here so that we don't have to consume as much oil ourselves and then ship as much of it as possible abroad to lower the price. Because let's say we didn't drill any oil, we didn't drill any gas, and we just went green, and that was all that we did to combat Russia. Well, the oil prices and gas prices are still going to be relatively high, which means Russia's still going to be able to pay the bills and everything. And even if they're not selling them to Germany and stuff anymore, which they would, but let's say they weren't, they just sell it to other countries that will never afford to have green energy. Like, let's say, for example, what's one? Let's say India, for example. India is like maybe 100 years off from having substantial green technology at this rate, maybe 200 years off. So they'll sell to India. They're going to make their money either way. But here's how you can actually hurt them and take that advantage away from them. You just lower the global price because it's a global price. How you do that? You just you dump the world supply massively. So instead of it being $80 a barrel where they can make a bit of a profit off of it, you make it $15 a barrel, and to the point where you're even losing money. But it's an investment in the long run security. And you hold it there for 5 years. Well, the Putin system is going to collapse at that point. On the point about, the climate change and everything, vastly overstated. Yeah, humans have some impact on that, but the extent to which that's the case is largely overstated by basically Russian hyped up Green parties, scientists, etc., that are sympathetic. And it's clear. I mean, why does the Russian state, the biggest petrol state in the world, far-right fascist petrol state, why do they support the Green parties in the West? Oh, could it be they support the Green party so that we don't drill oil to compete with them so they can do it themselves? That's basically what it is. And And as to the point of nuclear war ending civilization, Pentagon concluded that a war with Russia would see about 500 million people killed. In other words, about 95% of humanity would still go on. Like, it'd be bad. Don't get me wrong, it'd be bad. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. Most of the Russian stuff wouldn't get off the ground. Russia's by and large a paper tiger, and the United States would definitely win a nuclear war with Russia. And now I've laid out in a way where you don't have to do that. But if we don't destroy them economically, we will have to do that. But, at this rate, America would win that. So, and Putin knows it, so he wouldn't screw around.
I want to bring this opportunity to bring Esmin or Net7 into this. So, either one of you have a comment on Russia?
Net7 says he's going to be right back.
Okay. So I guess it's you. Your turn.
Yeah, comments on Russia. I will strongly agree with Kevin on the from the energy standpoint of bankrupting Russia. I think it would be a beautiful thing if the Kremlin pretty much collapsed, whether it's quickly or slowly. Most likely slowly. It'd be a beautiful thing to see. But by the way, just to go back to also what Kevin was saying is, look, I'm fine with mainly like an all of the above type strategy. I don't hate renewable energy. I'm a huge fan of it. But whatever way we can destroy the Kremlin's economy, whether it is overtly or covertly, whichever way we can do it, I would support it. And we could just say simply, as kind of like a tacit reminder to Putin when he denied his actions regarding Ukraine, we could deny it and say, hey, we're not doing anything to you. You can't prove it. At the time he introduced the Space Force to reply to Kevin, I will say I was torn because I do think that part of me said that's a total waste of money, but the other part said, I'll give it a shot. I'll give it a chance. I hope we don't have this type of thing where we're going to just militarize the fuck out of space. And sorry, I don't mean to curse in your program, but hopefully that's not going to happen, but it most likely will. But I'd say that if other countries are going to do so, then I would begrudgingly say, all right, let's do it. I don't know. I don't remember who was saying it, but they were claiming that the Space Force violated some international treaty, and I'd say, well, then you should amend that treaty or withdraw from it. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that front.
Is Net7 still here?
He's back.
Okay. Well, okay. You can now do your comment on Russia. I mean, not Russia, but Ukraine and Georgia.
Oh, certainly. Well, when we talk about Ukraine and Georgia, you obviously have to talk about the Kremlin in any conversation when talking about those two nations, because the Kremlin is heavily involved in both Ukraine and Georgia, obviously because they're former Soviet bloc countries and is trying to maintain a strong influence in the nation. I'm not for potential nuclear war with Russia. That is something that I'm not for, and I hope that we can avoid that, and that should be avoided certainly at all costs. But at the same time, we have to tell the Kremlin that their actions in the Ukraine and their cannot just simply be ignored. And simple statements of condemnation are not going to be enough for Putin. Putin has to be met with some sort of retaliation. The civil war going on in Ukraine is essentially because these military these groups over in eastern Ukraine that try to break away from Ukraine were supported and propped up by the Kremlin. And it goes back historically, because you have to remember that Stalin essentially tried to ethnically cleanse some of the areas of, what they called the kulaks, and essentially replace the people with ethnic Russians so he could maintain stronger control over the area. This goes a long way back. So obviously there are a lot of people within Ukraine who are ethnically Russian and speak Russian still and feel more part of Russia than they are of Ukraine. But even I don't like the idea of people voting to separate on ethno-nationalist lines, because we talk about ethno-nationalism in the US and we obviously condemn it because of the hatred and racism that go with it. But we need to look at then other regions too abroad and say, you know what? it's kind of the same thing. I mean, the people trying to break away are essentially ethno-nationalists, and that's not a good thing. And I don't like. So we need to stop the Kremlin's interference in this region. And look, words aren't going to cut it. We have to find a ground between, obviously preventing a full-scale war between the United States, NATO, and Russia, but also in ensuring that the Kremlin understands that it can't just do with this. And one of the best ways, I think, comes down to oil. If we do what Kevin says, we drill, and we economically bankrupt the Kremlin, we can essentially bring Putin down without firing a shot. Look, maybe green energy is the future. I doubt it. I don't think it is. But I'm willing to hear the options. But obviously, there needs to be something done about Putin, and words are not going to cut it.
All right. So if that's the end of that, oh, Liam, you have a question.
Just one quick thing. I don't really want to get into this or really argue it. I just want to lay out a point for people's consideration, because the whole argument of economic warfare over this, the driving the oil price down, for example, it has so many other consequences for the global economy and for other countries' stability, that crushing the price of oil is not. It's does a lot more harm than good. And given how the size of Russia's proven reserves and how much easier it is to get to a lot of them now, it's not going to matter. I mean, their oil is still going to be easier to get to than the Canadian oil is, and it's still going to be of higher quality. It's like you end up having to drag that out so long that how can we deal with the economic damage of the size or scale that we're talking about here? I just think we would end up causing a whole bunch of wars around the world and collapse a ton of economies just to try and thump chess with Russia. I would hope that there's another way, is all I'm saying. It just seems like a bigger problem rather than a solution.
All right. So I guess with that, we can go to our next topic if I can click the right button. All right. Oh well, that's kind of that one actually makes sense. So Armenia and Azerbaijan, the name of more.
Yeah.
This is a tough one.
Yeah.
First, can I go first, Grayson?
Sure.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and I'll tell you why. Because in Armenia, you have a government that's democratic, but it's very kind of religious, very almost ethno-religious, if you will. And then you have in Azerbaijan, which is sort of dictatorial, but it's even though it's Islamic, it's still pretty secular. And you have these two nations that have been fighting in a similar situation to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, in which they're fighting over essentially some square miles of land, in which both say, this is mine, no, this is mine, no, it belongs to me, and I have this historical claim. Oh no, this is mine because I have this historical claim. And the fact of the matter is that it's very difficult to solve these problems, because you have two factions that very much to cede ground would be seen as weakness, and neither want to do that. And the problem is that the Kremlin obviously stokes these divisions in Armenia, and obviously I do think that they obviously try to stoke the divisions also in Azerbaijan, because they hope they can play the two off against one another and obviously pick up the pieces and take what they can afterwards. Obviously, the United States has tried to have a democratic hand and try to get the parties to negotiate. It's obviously been difficult because of this whole land issue. The fact of the matter is this: look, the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis need to understand that They're both going to win some and they're both going to lose some in negotiations. And these problems that they have fighting over this land is only hurting them in the long run, because at the end of the day, to the north of them, they have the Kremlin, okay? And the Kremlin is simply laughing and looking at both and saying, great, once they, deal with each other, then we'll just pick up the pieces, whether, internationally, and we'll just manipulate things on our end and take advantage of the chaos, take advantage of the war, and get what we want. Both of these nations don't realize that while they're fighting each other over dirt, their northern neighbor, Russia, the Kremlin, is looking at them, with greedy eyes, intent on their resources and intent on influence and intent on their oil. So they need to start looking and seeing that they have a bigger threat here, which is the Kremlin. It's up to the United States to try to get them back to the negotiating table to stop violence. But the situation in Azerbaijan and Armenia is very complicated. It's not going to be solved in one meeting.
All right, so I guess we can go to one of the progressives. I know I've just been calling you all progressives, but Liam, I see you want to go first, so.
Well, I don't really care. I'm just saying, like, I'll comment wherever. I still don't know how the whole ping-ponging around works, so I don't want to jump in and butt in anything. So Armenia and Azerbaijan is really, so that with the whole Nagorno-Karabakh issue,
yeah,
it really does come back again to a kind of reactionary nationalism, and is this a good thing? There's some serious hardcore nationalist groups working in that area, and while it's tempting, I think, for a lot of people, and a lot of people in the West will look at this, oh, they're Christians, oh, they're like us, and they just kind of paper over the danger of that kind of nationalism and how it sort of feeds into this. So that does make me nervous. But again, as I keep saying over and over again, regardless of what I think of anyone's internal politics, I still believe in self-determination. And the borders in the entire Caucasus region make no sense. As far as I'm concerned, large portions of the Russian Caucasus should be able to be carved out. I don't have a problem with Chechnya or Dagestan becoming countries. I mean, I think that trying to hold people together in a federation that they don't want is a kind of injustice, even if I disagree with their politics over it. And the fact is that the Stalin era borders in that area are really, really weird and divide people up in strange ways. And I think some of that just goes back to the problem of ethno-nationalism in the first place. Why did we draw so many borders in the first place that were like this? If we had not tried to push the idea that peoples who are like me we should form our own country and not be like them and draw a border between us, that's ultimately at the origin of so many of these problems. And I think that constantly reacting to it, having to put out the fires caused by that, rather than trying somehow to get to the root of it and say, why can't we find ways to get along even if you speak a different language from me? So the hell what? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I mean, I grew up in the Long Beach area, and you walk one block in any different direction, people are speaking a different language, and I didn't care. The food was great. People are people. I just wish we could get that kind of if there was some way to encourage that kind of sensibility, at least, we wouldn't have these constant, pointless ethnic conflicts over, old irrational borders. So I agree there's a problem we got to deal with in terms of the current borders, but I wish we weren't constantly playing kind of like reactionary, let's fix it, rather than going to the root of the problem. So.
All right. And do we have another response from anyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say on the point about Azerbaijan and Armenia, I've talked with Jaeger de Pedo, who's in the chat actually on a number of occasions about this. He did interviews with people from both sides, and it's a focus of his. I agree with Jaeger on this one, which is that, the best thing that you can do in the position of the West here is to say, you call on both sides to de-escalate, and you don't necessarily involve yourself militarily. And part of the issue here is that you might think, well, Armenia, they're more of the democracy. Azerbaijan is aligned with Turkey and whatnot, and their dictatorship, so it should be kind of clear cut. Except not, because Armenia is aligned with Moscow, along with the Kremlin. I mean, this is what Net7 was talking about as well. Azerbaijan gets, some of their armaments from Israel. It's a really complicated and intertwined web where you've got, strange bedfellows on both sides. And there isn't really a very clear side that supporting would advance Western interests or, at this point, democratization, because Armenia is a pretty flawed democracy as it is. There's a lot of corruption there as well. And they're aligned with the Kremlin. And so you might think, well, if Armenia wins, you could, have more democracy in the Caucasus, except not, because we know that at the end of the day, it's kind of a shell of a democracy. Now, obviously, it's not anywhere near as bad as what they have in Azerbaijan. But then again, Azerbaijan also happens to be more secular. And I've supported secular dictators like the Shah, for example, as progressive force for modernization. So it's kind of like a tie. There are good parts and bad parts of both of the sides involved. And I'm never one to say, well, who started it? That's the person who's guilty or whatever, because I care about what their ideology is. So, like, for example, to me, if the West started the war against Hitler, I wouldn't say, oh, Hitler's the good guy because he's defending himself. I don't believe starting it or not starting it has any bearing on the morality. What I care about is what's the ideology of the side that's starting it. If it's a good ideology, then yeah, they should do a preemptive war and liberate the potential rival there. If it's not a good side doing it, if they're fascists doing it, then I'm going to be opposed to it. And in this case here, it's the sort of situation where it ultimately amounts to needless deaths, because regardless of which side wins, there's not a good ideology prevailing, essentially. And so if there's no good ideological ground to be gained, then why should people needlessly die? It's kind of like why, I call out the Westphalians all the time. Talk about how, it's moral relativism and bad and everything. But I have a nuanced view on Westphalianism. I actually think the Treaty of Westphalia was really good when it happened, because every country at the time was a dictatorship. They were all monarchies. So if they don't fight each other, well, that's good, because if France wins versus the UK, you still have to obey the French later now. It's like, for me, Westphalianism doesn't make any sense once America enters it, once you have a democracy. Well, now Westphalianism, well, now there is a democracy. Now there's a case for intervention. But if every country in the world is a dictator, then it makes sense for them not to fight each other, because it's just needless death. The case in the Caucasus is kind of analogous to that. And likewise, Westphalianism would make sense. If every country in the world was a democracy, then there's not really going to be anything gained from intervening anywhere. It would just be needless death at that point. So that's my view on that.
All right. So,
I have
Justin?
opinions on the Armenian and Azerbaijan dispute. So, I'm going to go from this in a really unorthodox perspective.
I'm not intended.
I was reading about the genetic makeup of Georgians and Azerbaijanians, and they are very similar genetically speaking. They're practically, I would say, indistinguishable from each other within the region. Yes, Azerbaijanian call themselves Turkic, and Armenians are Armenians, but so much of these divides are very arbitrarily created by arbitrary borders with arbitrary ideologies. And a thought just came to my mind that the Earth is ultimately a really, really small place, and we humans, we all have the same desires, the same hopes and dreams. Well, most of us do, and if we can just put aside the hatred for each other and work and establish like a united nation for what it truly is, and unite the entire Earth, these border ethnic conflicts will not have exist, and we can use the wealthier regions resource to develop more underdeveloped regions of the world and lift everyone up in a pan-globalist system. If we just put aside, these arbitrary differences, because at the end of the day, I see the border issues in both the Caucasus region and the African region as super arbitrarily created. And it's a sad reality that people are keeping so much hatred alive when the people living in these regions are so similar rather than different. By similar, I mean they live in a similar living situation, have the common struggle, and it's just really sad and tragic that these things are happening. And that's my commentary on this.
Okay. And Esmond, you're the final panelist, so
Oh, sorry, I just got distracted with what Liam was saying. Those two countries, I'm going to be completely honest, I don't look at them that closely, so I could not, in good faith, speak to those two countries. I'll be upfront with that. So, just one thing is there any disagreement on the whole? Because I keep hearing borders get mentioned. Is there any disagreement on foreign policy and borders between the quote progressives and the neocons? And I will agree that I do think that is a anti-Semitic dog whistle, Liam. The whole when the far right calls neocons and other groups globalist.
Yeah.
Globalist.
The thing about when I hear that term is that I don't get it. I don't ever get the same answer. One person gives me one answer, another person gives me another. So it's one of those like amorphous terms that's used to like say, oh, the enemy, But obviously, people on the the identitarians or the alt right use globalists essentially, to essentially accuse you of being a Jewish individual, So like sort of that international conspiracy thing. Really quickly though, I want to go back to the Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh. This is one of those regions, and where I don't think an intervention as a neoconservative would be a good idea because one, there's no clear-cut side as to who's good, who's bad, because both of these groups are fighting over territory that historically both lay claim to for one reason or another. Obviously, the Kremlin's involved trying to cause discontent for their own purposes. What we need to see in this region is a little bit more talking and less fighting. And what's going to need to happen is like, look, India and Bangladesh, remember, they had their enclaves, right? When they separated, India had enclaves in Bangladesh, Bangladesh had enclaves in India. What the Armenians and Azerbaijanis need to do is say, okay, look, the Nakhchivan region, that goes to Armenia. Then we're going to draw a border in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan is going to get like 60% or 70% of that, and we'll get the other part. And that would probably be a better thing. But the problem is neither wants to do that because each side wants to essentially have everything and essentially have their cake and eat it. And so it's a problem because this is why I don't like ethno-nationalism, and this is why I don't agree with all these ethnic movements in the Ukraine, because essentially it's essentially saying, look, we're not. It's essentially a way of saying, look, we're not united by our national identity. We're not united instead by what ethnic group we belong to, and that's the problem here: is that people are killing each other over this arbitrary reason when they're next door neighbors, and they could just instead trade with each other, date each other, have a good time with each other. So obviously this is something that is going to take longer to solve, but that's just my two piece.
All right, so if there's no other comments, we can go to the next subject. I'm going to take that silence as there is no comment, so let's spin the wheel.
Ooh,
It's back.
good one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Also, I noticed this wheel is for some reason just tactically avoiding the Middle East.
Mm.
Anyway, who wants to start with Pakistan and India? Because that is another very big can of worms.
Can I start? Because my wife is actually from Pakistan.
Oh yeah, sure. You have the floor.
Sure. I'm sorry, guys. I just want to start on this one because my wife is from Pakistan, so we get a lot of debates about this. So obviously, the problem with Pakistan is that we have in Pakistan what's a military dictatorship who's in charge, and then we have a lot of Islamist factions in the country. And what happens is the government in Islamabad really toes a fine line between doing what it wants, to essentially bleed India, but also playing off these radical Islamist groups in the country to not tick them off too much as to create a civil war. Women's rights in Pakistan are just absolutely atrocious. Domestic violence is rampant. My wife, for example, she said, I didn't want to marry a Pakistani guy because I didn't want to get, abused. I didn't want to get beat up, because it's so problematic over there. Even in her society, she's Ismaili, so she's from the northeastern part of the country, and that's a specific religious ethnic group over there who have, if I can describe it, they're kind of like Islam's Mormons, if you will. They have their own living day prophet, like the Aga Khan. So if that's kind of the simplest way to describe it. But the fact of the matter is that Pakistan's government is not our friend. They're not our ally. They supported the Taliban in Afghanistan because they were afraid of Afghanistan becoming an ally of India. And the issues between India and Pakistan go all the way back to British colonialism and also their separation, in which they were Muslim groups were killing Hindus, Hindu groups were killing Muslims. It was tit for tat. It was ethnic, religious violence that caused such terrible chaos. And the fact of the matter is that like in the present situation, Pakistan's government is not our friend. They're not our ally. And they are indirectly also responsible for the killing of U.S. troops by tacitly supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan through the ISI. Now, the ISI is essentially their version of their FBI or CIA. And the fact of the matter is that Pakistan is not our friend, it's not our ally, and the problem is they have nukes, which complicates the issue even more. Because let's say there was to be a radical Islamist group uprising in the country, okay, and they took over those nukes. That is a serious international concern, because if those were to be handed off to groups like the Al Qaeda or something, those would be used to terrible effect. But the problem is that Pakistan's government is just it needs to be treated in the same situation as we treat the CCP: hostile, against our interests, and an enemy, not a friend. There was a time for talk, there was a time for diplomacy, but instead of trying to legitimately come to the table, Pakistan supported terrorist groups in Afghanistan. And guess what happened? Then those terrorist groups migrated into Pakistan and then started killing Pakistani citizens. So they brought the terrorist problem from Afghanistan to Pakistan. So no, that we should not be friends with Pakistan. We should consider sanctions, and we need to really call out Pakistan for its human rights record in terms of its persecution of sexual minorities, also for its persecution of the LGBT community, and also Christians and other religious groups like the Ismailis. Pakistan's not our friend.
Okay, so do we have Liam? And let's see your fingers up.
Yeah, I'll just point out that I for the most part agree, given, again, the relatively corrupt nature of the Pakistani government and its own issues. I mean, there are some significant governance issues there, and then you obviously have massive problems with Islamist groups in the country. But India is in no better shape. Not only do you have various religious forms of terror there with like their Islamist groups operating inside India itself, but there's also a bunch of like Hindu nationalist movements that also commit atrocities against people. I mean, I mean, they both have significant issues of governance and conflicting ethno-nationalisms. I mean, in many ways, the division of the territory under Britain is the source of the problem. India as a country doesn't make a great deal of sense if you think in terms of like nation states. I mean, it's extraordinarily diverse. India is literally, South Asia is the same size as Europe. And the Mercator projection doesn't show it that way. The common maps you see in classroom walls, South Asia is the same size as fucking Europe. It's huge, and there's a lot of diversity within it. And if somehow you can make it work within a single India, and the number of Muslims in India is the same size as the number in Pakistan anyway, the division was completely pointless and arbitrary. And what it does is it allows people to continue to dig in, create these nationalist issues, and fight it out pointlessly. So I don't know. While there are significant problems in trying to find any kind of accord between the countries, reduce the tensions, they are nuclear powers since what, like 98, something like that, 98 or 99. It's been a while now. And, given that both countries also have significant terror and separatist movements, the fact that they're nuclear powers is dangerous. I would like to see greater effort diplomatically into finding some way to get along here. One of the reasons that Pakistan has historically been so badly governed is that it is a much smaller and poorer country in terms of the geography, the resources or whatever, but it felt a need to compete with India, which means it's one of those countries in the world that invested way, way too much into the military and security services and everything else, and not into human development. And that has some significant long-term consequences in feeding a lot of these violent groups in the first place. If you could reduce the military tensions and return the focus to human development in there, then in the long run, we could move away from a sense of necessary competition, a kind of like competing nationalism between these two countries. Because again, ultimately, it's pointless. I mean, there are Punjabis on either side of the border. Why is there a fight? It's so much of it is just completely unnecessary. And I hate seeing that kind of unnecessary violence in the world. There's no simple solution to it. You can't just walk in with a magic wand and fix the problems of the past, but you can learn from them and at least try to say, let's try to move in a different direction. Let's start talking to map out a better future where we don't have to be armed to the teeth and spending all this money on nukes and hating each other.
All right. I guess since Liam's done, I'm going to do something a little unorthodox here, and I'm actually going to get involved in this. Basically, when it comes to Pakistan and India, I think that when it comes to focusing on who is the ally in the situation, I lean towards India just because of the disputes with China. Make it the Jean Kirkpatrick doctrine, make sure that nation that's more pro-US is ultimately better than the nation that isn't pro-US, and I think Pakistan is generally worse than India, even though they're both pretty bad. That was just that was just me making my comments. I'll go to Esmond because, Justin, if they want to make a comment.
I would make a comment about the Indian-Pakistan situation, and in a lot of ways, it's the same thing we've seen in Nigeria and the same thing we've seen in Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's very arbitrary division of these two countries. But what makes India and Pakistan more dangerous than the other countries is nuclear weapons. They have nukes, and they can nuke each other and the countries surrounding them into oblivion should a nuclear war start. And that is very, very dangerous. So I guess the central theme throughout all these topics is, how do we get countries that hate each other to start working together and liking each other more? Because a lot of these stems from mistrust of each other. Pakistan thinks that India is going to invade them, and India thinks Pakistan is going to launch nukes at them, and there's such hostility. And I think the best situation to essentially reduce all of these potential danger and chaos is to figure out a way that we can make countries more trustful and less hostile towards each other, despite of their disagreements. Because because and this is such a hard issue because for historical reasons, countries hate each other and mistrust each other. But I actually think that if there is a way we can just show the different countries that no, the other countries are not going to attack you and they aren't going to take over your land. I believe a lot of the issues will be solved, but it is definitely easier said than done. And one of my, I guess, core idea I want to just emphasize again is the globalist agenda. I really think that a united nation and a united Earth together is going to solve a lot of these issues. And over maybe 3 or 4 generations, we can ease the hatred, because a lot of these hatred towards each other are propagated and propped up artificially by states who have ulterior motives, and these ethno-nationalism are being propped up by, I guess, other powers in the region who wants to play off the divisions and profit from them, because they need the resource themselves to defeat their arch nemesis and adversaries. But that stems from mistrust, and I just think that if we have a united globe, I think that's a far-fetched dream right now. Yeah, a lot of these conflicts will be lessened, and that's at the end of my commentary.
All right, so I guess we can go to Kevin now.
Okay. Yeah, so on, just before I get into Pakistan and India, I would say on the point about a united globe, I mean, anybody who watches my channel know ever since I started making content 2 years ago, I said right in the intro, like I eventually want to see the world become, not the United States of America, but the United States. I think that, we want to get to a point where there's one government down the road. Obviously, if people were to do my plan and take about 300 years, it'll probably take a lot longer than that. But, we should be moving in the direction of, basically consolidating things around a Western sort of a world order, essentially, where there is no more West, there's no more East, there's just the world, and everybody has human rights, democracy, capitalism, etc. And so, as far as it relates to Pakistan and India, Pakistan was a decent ally during the Cold War, but it's time to move on. And we're in 2 Cold Wars right now with Russia and China, and they're very close to China. China is building the deepest water port in the world on their southwestern coastline, and that's a problem. Additionally, we know that they harbor terrorists. So we know that the Pakistani government was aware of bin Laden and they harbored him, and they lied about it. They additionally were responsible for the terrorist attacks against Mumbai in 2008. They conduct all kinds of nefarious activities with their ISI, and they also created the Taliban. So this is something that, and they at every turn undermine, Western interests in Afghanistan. They're a huge problem. They shouldn't have nukes. And India, in contrast, India has been historically very close with Russia, and today they still do a good deal of trade with Russia. But I have a lot of faith that India has the potential to become the new manufacturing base for the West, and that we can get rich together with India. And we need to essentially, if I was in charge, I'd say no more trade with China. Anybody who does trade with China is getting sanctioned. We're going to bankrupt the Communist Party. They're not going to be able to sell anything anywhere. Nobody's going to have jobs anymore there. And all essential stuff, all heavy manufacturing is going to be done at home. And all non-essential, non-heavy manufacturing, that stuff can be transferred over to India instead of China. That'd be great, because India is actually a democracy. India has, yeah, they're not perfect. No country's perfect, but India is worlds ahead of communist China. And if we're going to be giving money to government in order to buy products, it should be the Republic of India, the largest democracy in the world, over the largest slave state in the world, in China. And so, as far as the point about them having nuclear weapons goes, Pakistan never should have been allowed to have nuclear weapons. That was insane that that was allowed to happen. And these windows of opportunity are such that you only have a limited amount of time to intervene before somebody does get nukes. And of course, they don't have that many nukes. They only have about 200 nuclear weapons. America has 8,000. So it's not, well, 6,500, 7,000. It's not that close, but it's enough to do a minimum deterrence, the same way that China has, the same way that India has. And you need to kind of understand that, well, they're an unstable state. It is very possible that they could at some point collapse and radical Islamist forces could outright take over, in which case you're going to have potentially those nuclear weapons either be given to terrorists, or the state of Pakistan just act as a vessel for those terrorists to attack India, for example. It's a big problem. And I'm of the view that we need to get closer with India. They need to become like the new China or whatever. And, unlike the whole meme with China where, if we trade with them, they'll liberalize, they'll democratize or whatever, which was BS. And some people, I think, genuinely believed it. Other people, I think, didn't. And they just wanted to make it a quick buck and outsource labor. We don't have that issue in India. India is already liberalized. India is a democracy. Now, sure, they need to do a lot more deregulation. I mean, the red tape in India is insane. They've got a huge problem with bureaucracy and whatnot, and just red tape in general. And they can definitely be made more efficient, and that'll help both of us. But I really think the characterization of India and Pakistan on equal terms it's not right. India has problems to work through, but they have a democratic process that can actually address that in a legitimate and humane way. Pakistan, in contrast, is basically it's essentially a military dictatorship. So that's my view on that. But yeah. So Liam just left. But.
Yeah, it looks like he's having difficulty. Wait, here he is. So that got weird, but we'll go to Esmond now, who once again has fallen last place. Sorry about that.
Oh, right. I forgot. I have to be the one to unmute myself. Not a whole lot of disagreement on this area. Yeah, it happens to the best of us, Liam. So far, Kevin's economic take with India, I strongly agree with. You mentioned, not you specifically, Kevin, but someone mentioned India and what country is not our friend? I can't remember which country was said not to be our friend. Pakistan, yeah. I also did not have any key disagreements with it. I would love to see, and I guess this is as Net 7 offered an olive branch to the non-interventionists, I'll offer an olive branch to the neoconservatives. Is I could maybe make an area of compromise where maybe we could maybe try to maybe manipulate's not the right word, but maybe manipulate using economic forces before we use brute force to achieve an end we want. But I also would have to say that I will admit that I do agree with Kevin on sanctions. I know this may be not so libertarian, but I generally don't care. Sometimes a country just needs to be sanctioned until they stop feeling the pain. Sometimes a sanction can do extreme damage on its own, and sometimes it might not be enough. That's really what I got to say.
All right. So, if there's no other comments, then we can go on to the.
I have a real quick comment. This is I do appreciate S-Man Speaks olive branch there, and hopefully that's an area we can agree on. I also want to mention a quick hot take real quick. Look, in 2003, instead of going into Iraq, although I do support Iraq intervention, I would have preferred we gone to Pakistan and get Osama bin Laden and bring down the current military dictatorship in Pakistan.
Okay, and so with that,
That's fair. That's fair.
How long are we going to go for, Grayson?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, does anyone have a? I guess whenever someone.
I have an early morning, so I'm starting to worry about the time.
Okay, so I guess we just do one more subject if that's okay with you, guys. So.
I'm all right with
Yeah.
it.
All right, so this would be the final subject.
If it's the Middle East, I'll laugh.
Oh, we're going to be here all night.
Oh my.
We're going to be here all night.
Did I jinx that?
Well,
Yes.
I'll
Sorry.
be back in a minute.
I
This
missed
one.
Okay, finally, I was hoping it was Iraq.
Wait, it is Iraq.
What
Yeah.
is it? I missed it. It's Iraq?
It's Iraq. It's going to take forever.
Should we
be
just
back
do
in a minute.
closing and then do Iraq next time? Because, oh, man.
Yeah,
Oh.
no. I seriously, I think the Iraq War should be its own debate. Honestly,
Yes.
like we can't do like 10 minutes for Iraq.
Part
I
3.
mean,
Favor say aye.
yeah, part 3.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, Kevin, if you ever want to talk directly about that kind of stuff, we can discuss. I'd quite enjoy
Oh,
discussing.
yeah,
it.
actually, I'll say this on Kevin's behalf. If you DM him on Twitter, he accepts most debate requests.
I accept all debate requests.
Oh, yeah.
Like literally anybody can debate me. It doesn't matter if you have 100 or 1,000 or 1 follower or whatever. I debate anybody. So
Yeah, just let me know if you ever want to chat about this one because the Iraq War sort of the whole situation, the entire 20th century of Iraq is fascinating. So it's a
Okay, so I guess we
Yeah.
can go to closing remarks. We'll start with Esmond and just go down the line.
Okay. Once again, thank you, Grayson. It's always good to have these conversations. I'd also like to again say that I do appreciate Net7's olive branch, and I have no problem making some compromises with neoconservatives, and I understand it will depend on what it is. I will say that it is also good to understand that the non-interventionists and interventionists can agree that some of the opinions from some non-interventionists that are absolutely racist are wrong and should not be put into the mainstream of the debate. I would say that in closing, I would hope, and I mean, I understand we all want the same thing. It's how we get there is where we differ. I would just hope that if the neocons are to prevail, let's say that neocons were the majority in this country, and I guess in Canada too, I have to be inclusive. I will hope, for their sake, I'm going to hope that they're right, because if they're not, then it would be then that would create a whole host of problems. But I would say that I guess my closing comment is just going to be that under this new president, I'd say that that it's just going to be a multi-regional problem of like dealing with Russia and China, and Syria is always going to be a complicated mess. And hot take before I go, I will admit I did watch Hillary Clinton saying that we saw, he died. I have to admit that was hilarious. And thank you for having me.
All right. And we'll go to Net7, who hopefully won't use his closing remarks like last time.
Well, thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you all my fellow co-panelists and debaters. I do appreciate hearing your perspectives. And I do also want to thank S-Man Speaks for we have both of us coming to a bit of a compromise and agreement on a couple things. I'll close with this. S-Man Speaks came up with a question. He said, well, what if the neoconservatives are wrong? But that's the wrong question to ask, because time and time again, the neoconservative position has been proven right. A lack of intervention in Rwanda allowed for the genocide that we saw, in which millions of people died in a completely avoided genocide, in which had we intervened, we could have stopped it. In Darfur, we had hundreds of thousands of people died in an intervention that could have prevented that. Justin Lee talked about a Truman, plan 2.0, which we help support other nations, and that will create peace. I'm not opposed to that. Neoconservatives aren't opposed to that whatsoever. We want to help build. We support nation building. We agree with the idea of building nations because you have to support democracy. Democracy and republics are like children. You have to bring them up, because when you have a nation like Iraq, for example, which was controlled by a one-man dictator, you then have to support the Republican democratic process through, because you have to ensure that those who are on the wings hoping that it will fail do not succeed. And it's not simply on Darfur, and it's not simply on Rwanda. We were proven right where we succeeded. For example, in Serbia, Bosnia, we are proven right on numerous other occasions, and we're being proven right even in Myanmar, in which Myanmar, the military leadership, is killing its own civilians, and they're doing so because they feel that they can, and they feel that if they kill only just enough, no one's going to intervene. Well, it's time for the international global order. It's time for the United States, Canada, and the world to step in and say, no, your dictatorial rule is at an end, and we are going to support libertarian principles of freedom, liberty, and democracy in these nations, and we're going to stop you from oppressing your people, because no state, no government, no organization has a monopoly or a legal right to oppress its people. I'll close with that. Thank you.
All right, and we can go to Liam O'Mara. Dr. Liam O'Mara, I would say that.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for this. It's a slightly different sort of vibe, but interestingly similar. I honestly miss the discussions that we had in grad school, where people would just get around the table and we've all done X readings for the week, and we're going to sit around and we're going to just yammer on this and talk about it. And you get the range of perspectives. I've always quite enjoyed that kind of engagement, but I never really got into internet discussions. I'm one of those people that, I don't see the point of debate per se, because people usually don't change their positions on the basis of an argument. It's a long personal process, and we change our own minds. But I enjoy the exchange of ideas. I enjoy tossing things around and hearing where people are coming from. And this kind of environment that we have now, where we have these kind of, we can communicate through our cameras and microphones and talk to each other, it's really fascinating to me. So I don't know. I just want to say thank you for inviting me in, leftist that I am, to, yammer about these issues. And I'm quite, I quite enjoy tossing ideas around from different perspectives on this foreign policy stuff. So again, just thanks to all for putting up with me.
Yeah. And so we can go to Justin.
I want to thank you, Grayson, for inviting me onto this panel, as well as Dr. Liam O'Mara, Asman Speaks, Net7, and Kevin Castley for being my co-panelist. I learned truly a lot from you guys in today's episode. I want to bring up a final thought that I had while debating you guys, the neocons, today, and that is the Western system truly the most advanced system, the best possible system that we have? Because France, Great Britain, and the United States, and even Canada have different forms of democracy. Some have a representative democracy, some have a parliamentary system, and some people even have the idea of a direct democracy. And I think that not all countries are suited for a United States or a Western style democracy, and based on each country's local conditions and culture, their democracy might develop in a different fashion than how it developed in the United States, in France, in Europe, in Great Britain. And I believe that when we are using economic warfare and direct warfare, we should be very cautious of the consequences it might cause, such as crashing other countries' economy, such as creating a huge refugee crisis. And truly, I wish more peace, freedom, and democracy around the world. And I'm willing to hear all ideas to achieve that final destination and that final goal. And I'm done with my final commentary.
All right, and to go to the final guest, we have Kevin Castley. Thank you for being here. As always.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the debate tonight, Grayson, and as well, thank you to everybody for being here to, represent your ideas and put them forth. Because oftentimes I'll have people, in my show, I stream every day. I'll have people that will say, "Oh, my ideas are wrong, they're flawed, and everything." Yet when you say, "Okay, shoot me a DM, let's debate," they shy away. They can't actually defend their positions. They've got nothing. You guys here showed up. You guys made your case, and I can appreciate that, And because that, for example, Jack Posobiec, he can't do that. He doesn't have the courage to do it. He said he was happy to debate any neocon anytime, and I'm still blocked, and he refuses to debate me still. Whereas you guys are here, and you guys debated me, so you guys actually have the courage of your convictions in that regard. So I appreciate that. Additionally, I'll close out by saying, everybody here is welcome to debate me one-on-one. I mean, people in my community debate me too on like nuanced areas of disagreement, even though we're like both hawks and stuff and everything. I always welcome debates. Additionally, I would say to Justin Lee's question, I would answer yes, like unironically, yes, the West is the best. And yeah, France has a slightly different, semi-presidential system. You got the UK parliamentarian system, like in Canada, and then you got the adversarial presidential system, like in the United States. All those are, democracies. For the extent is what we're talking about democracy. You can choose the various nuances of it and everything. That's up for self-determination. But when we talk about spreading democracy and everything, we're talking about, the Western idea of rule of law, independent judiciary. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about free markets, that kind of stuff. The basic institutions, the basic building blocks. You can choose what flag you want. You can choose what orders of speaking time you want in your legislature. You can choose if you're going to have a unicameral or a bicameral legislature, or maybe even a tricameral one. Who cares? Doesn't matter. As long as the fundamental principles of democracy are in place and human dignity, we don't care. But we understand that the world right now is divided between the free and the enslaved, between islands of freedom and continents of slavery. And in the continents of slavery, there is no such thing to even resemble the basic building blocks of what we would see as democracy, when you've got gulags and you've got genocide, such as in the case of communist China right now in Xinjiang. So to kind of close this out and everything, I would just say, I think it's fairly clear that the historical examples and everything have vindicated the side of myself, as well as Net7 here, of neoconservatives and interventionists at large, that in general, inaction breeds greater conflict down the road, which yields a higher magnitude of loss of life. That inaction can oftentimes see vastly disproportionate amounts of people die from what might have otherwise been a relatively routine procedure. And of course, the case of Rwanda exemplifies this tremendously. I think it's clear that we live in a dual Cold War right now. We have a Cold War with fascist Russia, who is expansionist, ambitious. They are, obviously bombing Syria. They have invaded Europe. They have invaded Georgia. They have invaded Ukraine. They seek to invade the Baltics, for example. And it's very clear we need to be tough on them. It's very clear that our side has been vindicated here. We have, of course, the same thing happening with communist China right now. And they have an internal genocide that's being waged. And all of this, anti-interventionism, non-interventionism, isolationism, all of its variants and whatnot, fail to address the material realities of the world, which is that, we don't live in a world of democracies deciding what they're going to do and whatnot. It's not. We're not saying, oh, we should invade some democracy like, say, the Netherlands because they voted to decriminalize drugs. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about countries that don't afford their people the ability to even have a say in their self-determination, like in Syria, for example. where the people wanted to have a say and they were butchered and slaughtered, and 8 million of them had to flee. So with that, thank you, and yeah, hopefully we can do a debate in the future. So
All
have a
right.
good night, everybody.
So with that, I will end the broadcast now. Thank you all for tuning in. And I don't have a catchphrase.
Stay
This one
classy.
day. Stay classy.